Okay, I really last minute realized I needed to read this. Uh, so, and this is another big, long 28-page chapter. So, to make things a little bit easier, there are two sections called Makers of America, and I think I'm just gonna skip those for time. So I'm gonna read like 278 to 292, and I'm skipping all of the Makers of America things and the like excess, like, oh, here's a little factoid thing, so that I can just finish reading like all the main content real fast, because we have a test tomorrow and I didn't study. Okay, let's see. Okay, chapter 14, Forging the National Economy. I don't have a drink. I'm going to die. Just 1 second. Let me run and get one. Okay, I jumped. Whew. That took me like 10 seconds. Okay. Okay, chapter 14. Forging the National Economy. The new nation bounded into the 19th century in a burst of movement. New England Yankees, Pennsylvania farmers, Southern yeomen, cotton lords, and their enslaved workers all pushed west in search of land and opportunity. Soon to be joined by vast numbers of immigrants from Europe, who also made their way to the country's fast-growing cities. And not only people were in motion. Newly invented machinery boomed the cultivation of crops and the manufacture of goods, while workers, free and enslaved alike, labored even longer, harder, and faster. Better roads, faster steamboats, farther-reaching canals, and riveting railroad lines all moved people, foodstuffs, raw materials, oh my god, I ran, and manufactured goods from coast to coast, from Gulf to Great Lakes, and from American shores to the wider world. The prodigious momentum of burgeoning American capitalism gave rise to an economy that was remarkably dynamic. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Remarkably dynamic, market-driven, continentally scaled, and internationally consequential. The westward movement, the rise of Andrew Jackson, the first president from beyond the Appalachian Mountains, exemplified the relentless westward march of the American people. The West, with its raw frontier, began to acquire its mythical status as the most American part of America. As Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in 1844, Europe stretches to the Alleghenies, America lies beyond. The Republic was young, and so were the people. As late as 1850, half of Americans were under the age of 30. They were also restless and energetic, seemingly always on the move and always westward. One tall tale of frontier described chickens that voluntarily crossed their legs every spring, waiting to be tied for the annual move west. By 1840, the demographic center of the American population map had crossed the Alleghenies. By the end of the Civil War, it had marched across the Ohio River. Legend portrays an army of muscular axemen triumphantly carving civilization out of the western woods, but in reality life was downright grim for most pioneer families. Poorly fed, ill-clad, housed in hastily erected shanties, Abraham's Lincoln family lived for a year in a three-sided lean-to made of brush and sticks. They were perpetual victims of disease, depression, and premature death. Above all, the unbearable loneliness haunted them, especially the women, who were often cut off from human contact. Even their neighbors, for days or even weeks, while confined to the cramped orbit of a dark cabin in a secluded clearing. Breakdowns and even madness were all too frequently the opportunities that the frontier offered to pioneer women. Frontier life could be tough and crude for men as well. No-holds-barred wrestling, which permitted such niceties as the biting off of noses and the gouging out of eyes, was popular entertainment. Pioneering Americans, marooned by geography, were often ill-informed, superstitious, provincial, and fiercely individualistic. Ralph Waldo Emerson's popular lecture essay, Self-Reliance, struck a deeply responsive chord. Popular literature of the period abounded with portraits of unique, isolated figures like James Fenimore Cooper's heroic Natty Bumppo and Herman Melville's restless Captain Ahab, just as Jacksonian politics aimed to emancipate the lone wolf, enterprising business person. Yet even in this heyday of rugged individualism, there were important exceptions. Pioneering men, facing tasks clearly beyond their own individual resources, relied upon the labor of their womenfolk, children, and neighbors, and, in the booming cotton South, their slaves, for log rolling and barn raising. Community was crucial to survival, as were governments, local as well as federal, for help in building internal improvements like canals and roads. Okay, I just took my jacket off. Wait, where'd my earbud go? Oh, I found it. Okay. Shaping the Western landscape. The westward movement also molded the physical... It's taking me so long. The physical environment. Pioneers in a hurry often exhausted the land in the tobacco regions and then pushed on, leaving behind barren and rain-gutted fields. In the Kentucky bottomlands, cane as high as 15 feet posed a seemingly insurmountable barrier to the plow. But settlers soon discovered that when the cane was burned off, European bluegrass thrived in the charred cane fields. Kentucky bluegrass, as it was somewhat inaccurately called, made ideal pasture for livestock and lured 1,000 more American homesteaders into Kentucky. The American West felt like the pressure of civilization in additional ways. By the 1820s, American fur trappers were setting their trap lines all over the vast Rocky Mountain region. The fur trapping empire was based on the rendezvous, French for meeting, system. Each summer, traders ventured from St. Louis to verdant Rocky Mountain Valley, made camp, and waited for the trappers and Indians to arrive with beaver pelts to swap for manufactured goods from the east. This trade had thrived for some 2 decades. By the time the beaver hats had gone out of fashion, the hapless beaver had all but disappeared from the region. Trade in buffalo robes also flourished, leading eventually to the virtually total annihilation of the massive bison herds that once blanketed the western prairies. Still farther west on the California coast, other traders bought up prodigious quantities of sea otter pelts, driving the once bountiful otters to the point of near extinction. Some historians have called this aggressive and often heedless exploitation of the West's natural bounty ecological imperialism. Yet Americans in this period also revered nature and admired its beauty. Indeed, the spirit of the nationalism fed a growing belief in the uniqueness of the American wilderness. Searching for the United States' distinctive characteristics in this nation-conscious age, many observers found the wild, unspoiled character of the land, especially in the West, to be among the young nation's defining attributes. Other countries might have impressive mountains or sparkling rivers, but none had the pristine, natural beauty of America, unspoiled by human hands and reminiscent of a time before the dawn of civilization. This attitude toward wilderness became in a time kind of a national mystique, inspiring literature and painting, and eventually kindling a powerful conservation movement. George Catlin, a painter and student of Native American life, was among the first Americans to advocate the preservation of nature as a deliberate national policy. In 1832, he observed Sioux Indians in the South Dakota recklessly slaughtering buffalo in order to trade the animals' tongues for the white man's whiskey. Appalled at this spectacle and fearing for the preservation of Indians and buffalo alike, Catlin proposed the creation of a national park. His idea later bore fruit with the creation of a national park system, the world's first, beginning with Yellowstone Park in 1872. The March of the Millions. As the American people moved west, they also multiplied at an amazing rate. By mid-century, the population was still doubling approximately every 25 years, as in fertile colonial days. By 1860, the original 13 states had more than doubled in number. 33 stars graced the American flag. The United States was the 4th most populous nation in the Western world, exceeded only by the 3 European countries, Russia, France, and Austria. Urban growth continued explosively. In 1790, there had been only 2 American cities that could boast populations of 20,000 or more souls, Philadelphia and New York. By 1860, there were 43, and about 300 other places claimed over 5,000 inhabitants apiece. New York was the metropolis, New Orleans the queen of the South, and Chicago the swaggering lord of the Midwest, destined to be the hog butcher for the world. Such over-rapid urbanization unfortunately brought undesirable byproducts. It intensified the problems of smelly slums, feeble street lighting, inadequate policing, impure water, foul sewage, ravenous rats, and improper garbage disposal. Hogs poked their scavenging snouts about many city streets as late as the 1840s. Boston in 1823 pioneered a sewer system, and New York in 1842 abandoned wells and cisterns for a piped-in water supply. The city thus unknowingly eliminated the breeding places of many disease-carrying mosquitoes. A continuing high birth rate accounted for most of the increase in population, but by the 1840s, the tides of immigration were adding hundreds of thousands more. Before this decade, immigrants had been flowing in at a rate of 60,000 a year, but suddenly the influx tripled in the 1840s and then quadrupled in the 1850s. During these 2 feverish decades, over 1.5 million Irish and nearly as many Germans swarmed down the gangplanks. Why did they come? The immigrants came partly because Europe seemed to be running out of room. The population of the Old World more than doubled in the 19th century, and Europe began to generate a seething pool of apparently surplus people. They were displaced and footloose in their homelands before they felt the tug of the American magnet. Indeed, at least as many people moved about within Europe as crossed the Atlantic. America benefited from these people-churning changes, but did not set them all in motion, nor was the United States the sole beneficiary of the process. Of the nearly 60 million people who abandoned Europe in the century after 1840, about 25 million went somewhere other than the United States. Yet America still beckoned most strongly to the struggling masses of Europe, and the majority of migrants headed for the land of freedom and opportunity. There was freedom from aristocratic caste and state church. There was abundant opportunity to secure broad acres and better one's condition. Much read letters sent home by immigrants, America letters, often described in glowing terms the richer life, low taxes, no compulsory military service, and 3 meat meals a day. The introduction of a transoceanic steamships also meant that the immigrants could come speedily and cheaply. The journey to the United States now took 10 or 12 days instead of 10 or 12 weeks on a sailing vessel, and was much less expensive than a voyage to more distant immigrant destinations such as Australia, Argentina, or South Africa. The United States also received a far more diverse array of immigrants than did other countries. Argentina, for example, had a higher proportion of immigrants relative to its population than did the United States, but they came mostly from Spain and Italy. In contrast, the United States beckoned to immigrants from dozens of different nations. The Emerald Isle moves west. Ireland, already groaning under the heavy hand of British overlords, was prostrated in the mid-1840s. A terrible rot attacked the potato crop on which the people had become dangerously dependent, and about 1/4 of them were swept away by disease and hunger. Starved bodies were found dead by the roadside with grass in their mouths. All told, about 2 million perished. Tens of thousands of destitute souls, fleeing the land of famine for the land of plenty, flocked to America in the Black Forties. Ireland's great export has been population, and the Irish take their place beside the Jews and the Africans as dispersed people. These uprooted newcomers, too poor to move west and buy the necessary land, livestock, and equipment, swarmed into the larger seaboard cities. Noteworthy were Boston and particularly New York, which rapidly became the largest Irish city in the world. Before many decades had passed, more people of Hibernian blood lived in America than on the old soil of Erin's Isle. The luckless Irish immigrants received no red carpet treatment. Forced to live in squalor, they were rudely crammed into the already vile slums. They were scorned by the older American stock, especially proper Protestant Bostonians, who regarded the scruffy Catholic arrivals as a social menace. Barely literate biddies, Bridgets, took jobs as kitchen maids. Broad-shoulders Patricks, were published into pick-and-shovel drudgery on canals and railroads, where thousands left their bones as victims of disease and accidental explosions. It was said that an Irishman lay buried under every railroad tie. As wage-depressing competitors for jobs, the Irish were hated by native workers. "No Irish need apply" was a sign commonly posted at factory gates and was often abbreviated to Nina. The Irish, for similar reasons, fiercely resented the blacks, with whom they shared society's basement. Race riots between black and Irish dock workers flared up in several port cities, and the Irish were generally cool to the abolitionist cause. The friendless, famine Irish were forced to fend for themselves. The ancient order of Hibernians, a semi-secret society founded in Ireland to fight rapacious landlords, served in America as a benevolent society, aiding the downtrodden. It also helped to spawn the Molly Maguires, a shadowy Irish miners' union that rocked the Pennsylvania coal districts in the 1860s and 1870s. The Irish tended to remain in low-skill occupations, but gradually improved their lot, usually by acquiring modest amounts of property. The education of children was cut short as families struggled to save money to purchase a home. But for humble Irish peasants, cruelly cast out of their homeland, property ownership counted as a grand success. Politics quickly attracted these gregarious Gaelic newcomers. They soon began to gain control of powerful city machines, notably New York's Tammany Hall, and reaped the patronage rewards. Before long, beguilingly brogued Irishmen dominated police departments in many big cities, where they now drove the paddy wagons that had once carted their brawling forebears to jail. American politicians made haste to cultivate the Irish vote, especially in the politically potent state of New York. Irish hatred of the British lost nothing in the transatlantic transplanting. As the Irish Americans increased in number, nearly 2 million arrived between 1830 and 1860, officials in Washington glimpsed political gold in these emerald green hills. Politicians often found it politically profitable to fire verbal volleys at London, a process vulgarly known as twisting the British lion's tail. The German 48ers. The influx of refugees from Germany between 1830 and 1860 was hardly less spectacular than that from Ireland. During these troubled years, over 1.5 million Germans stepped onto American soil. The bulk of them were uprooted farmers, displaced by crop failures and other hardships, but a strong sprinkling were liberal political refugees. Saddened by the collapse of the democratic revolutions of 1848, they had decided to leave the autocratic fatherland and flee to America, the brightest hope of democracy. Germany's loss was America's gain. Zealous German liberals like the lanky and public-spirited Karl Schurz, a relentless foe of slavery and public corruption, contributed richly to the elevation of American political life. Unlike the Irish, many of the Germanic newcomers possessed a modest amount of material goods. Most of them pushed out to the lush lands of the Middle West, notably Wisconsin, where they settled and established model farms. Like the Irish, they formed an influential body of voters whom American politicians shamelessly wooed. But the Germans were less potent politically because their strength was more widely scattered. The hand of Germans in shaping American life was widely felt and still Oh my god, I can't read. The hand of Germans in shaping American life was widely felt in still other ways. The Conestoga wagon, the Kentucky rifle, and the Christmas tree were all German contributions to American culture. Germans had fled from the militarism and wars of Europe and consequently came to be a bulwark of isolationist sentiment in the upper Mississippi Valley. Better education on the whole than the stump-grubbing Americans, they warmly supported public schools, including their kindergarten, children's garden. They likewise did much to stimulate art and music. As outspoken champions of freedom, they became relentless enemies of slavery during the fevered years before the Civil War. Yet the Germans, often dubbed damned Dutchmen, were occasionally regarded with suspicion by their old-stock American neighbors. Seeking to preserve their language and culture, they sometimes settled in compact colonies and kept aloof from the surrounding community. Accustomed to the continental Sunday and uncurbed by Puritan tradition, they made merry on the Sabbath and drank huge quantities of an amber beverage called beer, which dates to its real popularity in America to their coming. Their old world drinking habits, like those of the Irish, spurred advocates of temperance and the use of alcohol to redouble their reform efforts. The invasion of this so-called immigrant rabble in the 1840s and 50s inflamed the prejudices of American nativists. They feared that these foreign hordes would outbreed, outvote, and overwhelm the old native stock. Not only did the newcomers take jobs from Native Americans, but the bulk of the displaced Irish were Roman Catholics, as were a substantial minority of the Germans. The Church of Rome was still widely regarded by many old-line Americans as a foreign church. Convents were commonly referred to as popish brothels. Roman Catholics were now on the move. Seeking to protect their children from Protestant indoctrination in the public schools, they began in the 1840s to construct an entirely separate Catholic educational system, an enormously expensive undertaking for a poor immigrant community, but one that revealed the strength of its religious commitment. They had formed a negligible minority during colonial days, and their numbers had increased gradually, but with the enormous influx of the Irish and Germans in the 1840s and 50s, the Catholics had become a powerful religious group. In 1840, they had ranked fifth behind the Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. By 1850, with some 1.8 million communicants, they had bounded into first place, a position they have never lost. Older stock Americans were alarmed by these mounting figures. They professed to believe that in due time the alien riffraff would establish the Catholic Church at the expense of Protestantism and would introduce popish idols. The nosier American nativists rallied for political action. In 1849, they formed the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, which soon developed into the formidable American Party, more commonly known as the Know-Nothing Party, a name derived from its secretiveness. Nativists agitated for rigid restrictions on immigration and naturalization, and for laws authorizing the deportation of alien paupers. They also promoted a lurid literature of exposure, much of it pure fiction. The authors, sometimes posing as escaped nuns, described the shocking sins they imagined the cloisters concealed, including the secret burial of babies. One of these sensational books, Maria Monk's Awful Disclosures, sold over 300,000 copies. And even uglier was occasional mass violence. As early as 1834, a Catholic convent near Boston was burned by a howling mob, and in ensuing years, a few scattered attacks fell upon Catholic schools and churches. The most frightful flare-up occurred during 1844 in Philadelphia, where the Irish Catholics fought back against the threats of the nativists. The city of brotherly love did not quiet down until 2 Catholic churches had been burned and some 13 citizens had been killed and 50 wounded in several days of fighting. These outbursts of intolerance, though infrequent and generally localized in the larger cities, remain an unfortunate blot on the record of America's treatment of minority groups. Immigrants were undeniably making America a more pluralistic society, one of the most ethnically and racially varied in the history of the world, and perhaps it was a small wonder that cultural classes would occur. Why, in fact, were such episodes not even more frequent and more violent? Part of the answer lies in the robustness of the American economy. The vigorous growth of the economy in these years both attracted immigrants in the first place and ensured that once arrived, they could claim their share of American wealth without jeopardizing the wealth of others. Their hands and brains, in fact, helped fuel economic expansion. Immigrants in the American economy, in short, needed one another. Without the newcomers, a preponderantly agricultural United States might well have been condemned to watch in envy as the Industrial Revolution swept through 19th century Europe. Creeping mechanization. A group of gifted British inventors, beginning about 1750, perfected a series of machines for the mass production of textiles. This harnessing of steam multiplied the power of human muscle some 10,000-fold and ushered in the modern factory system, and with it, the so-called Industrial Revolution. It was accompanied by a no less spectacular transformation in agricultural production and in the methods of transportation and communication. The factory system gradually spread from Britain, the world's workshop, to other lands. It took a generation or so to reach Western Europe and then the United States. Why was the youthful American Republic, eventually to become an industrial giant, so slow to embrace the machine? For one thing, land was cheap in America. Land-starved descendants of land-starved peasants were not going to coop themselves up in smelly factories when they might till their own acres in God's fresh air and sunlight. Labor was therefore generally scarce, and enough nimble hands to operate the machines were hard to find until immigrants began to pour ashore in the 1840s. Money for capital investment, moreover, was not plentiful in pioneering America, whose industrial revolution, like that of many a developing country in later centuries, awaited an influx of foreign capital, which in turn awaited assurance of secure property rights, sufficient infrastructure, and an adequate workforce, and political stability. Without such capital, raw materials lay undeveloped, undiscovered, or unsuspected. The Republic was one day to become the world's leading coal producer, but much of the coal burned in colonial times was imported all the way from Britain. The young country also had difficulty producing goods of high enough quality and cheap enough cost to compete with the mass-produced European products. Long-established Britain factories, in particular, provided cutthroat competition. The superiority was attested by the fact that a few unscrupulous Yankee manufacturers, out to make a dishonest dollar, stamped their own products with fake English trademarks. The British also enjoyed a monopoly of the textile machinery, whose secrets they were anxious to hide from foreign competitors. Parliament enacted laws, in harmony with the mercantile system, forbidding the export of the machines or the emigration of mechanics able to reproduce them. Although a small number of manufacturing enterprises existed in the early Republic, the future industrial colossus was still soaring. Not until well past the middle of the 19th century did the value of the output of factories exceed that of the farms. Whitney ends the fiber famine. Samuel Slater has been acclaimed the father of the factory system in America, and seldom can be the paternity of a movement more properly to be ascribed to one person. A skilled British mechanic of 21, he was attracted by bounties being offered to British workers familiar with the textile machines. After memorizing the plans for the machinery, he escaped in disguise to America, where he won the backing of Moses Brown, a Quaker capitalist in Rhode Island. Laboriously reconstructing the essential apparatus with the aid of a blacksmith and a carpenter, he put into operation in 1791 the first efficient American machinery for spinning cotton thread. The ravenous mechanism was now ready, but where was the cotton fiber? Hand-picking 1 pound of lint from 3 pounds of seed was a full day's work for one slave, and this process was so expensive that American-made cotton cloth was relatively rare. Another mechanical genius, Massachusetts-born Eli Whitney, now made his mark. After graduating from Yale, he journeyed to Georgia to serve as a private tutor while preparing for the law. There, he was told that the poverty of the South would be relieved if someone could only invent a workable device for separating the seed from the short staple cotton fiber. Within 10 days, in 1793, he built a crude machine called the cotton gin that was 50 times more effective than the hand-picking process. Few machines have ever wrought so wondrous a change. The gin affected not only the history of America, but that of the world. Almost overnight, the raising of cotton became highly profitable, and the South was tied hand and foot to the throne of King Cotton. Human bondage had been dying out, but the insatiable demand for cotton re-riveted the chains on the limbs of the downtrodden Southern blacks. South and North both prospered. Slave-driving planters cleared more acres for cotton, pushing for cotton kingdoms westward off the depleted Tidewater plains, over the Piedmont and onto the black loam bottom lands of Alabama and Mississippi. Humming gins poured out avalanches of snowy fiber for the spindles of Yankee machines, though for decades to come the mills of Britain brought the lion's share of Southern cotton. The American phase of the Industrial Revolution, which first blossomed in cotton textiles, was well on its way. Factories at first flourished most actively in New England, though they branched out into more populous areas of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The South, increasingly wedded to the production of cotton, could boast its comparatively little manufacturing. Its capital was bound up in slaves. Its local consumers, for the most part, were desperately poor. New England was singularly favored as an industrial center for several reasons. Its narrow belt of stony soil made farming difficult and hence made manufacturing attractive. A relatively dense population provided labor and accessible markets. Shipping brought in capital, and snug seaports made it easy made easy the import of raw materials and the export of finished products. Finally, the rapid rivers, notably the Merrimack in Massachusetts, provided abundant water power to turn the cogs of the machines. By 1860, more than 400 million pounds of southern cotton poured annually into the gaping maws of over 1,000 mills, mostly in New England. Marvels in manufacturing. America's factories spread slowly until about 1807, when there began the fateful sequence of embargo, non-intercourse, and the War of 1812. Stern necessity dictated the manufacture of substitutes for normal imports, while the stoppage of European commerce was temporarily ruinous to Yankee shipping. Both capital and labor were driven from waves onto the factory floor, as New England, in the striking phrase of John Randolph, exchanged the trident for the distaff. Generous bounties were offered by local authorities for homegrown goods. Buy American and wear American became the popular slogans, and patriotism prompted the wearing of baggy homespun garments. President Madison donned some at his inauguration, where he was said to have been a walking argument for the better processing of native wool. But the manufacturing boomlet broke abruptly with the Peace of Ghent in 1815. British competitors unloaded their dammed-up surpluses at ruinously low prices, and American newspapers were so full of British advertisements for goods on credit that little space was left for news. In one Rhode Island district, all 150 mills were forced to close their doors, except the original Slater plant. Responding to pained outcries, Congress provided some relief when it passed the mildly protective tariff of 1816, among the earliest political contests to control the shape of the economy. As the factory system flourished, it embraced numerous other industries in addition to textiles. Prominent among them was the manufacturing of firearms, and here the wizardly Eli Whitney again appeared with an extraordinary contribution. Frustrated in his earlier efforts to monopolize the cotton gin, he turned to the mass production of muskets for the U.S. Army. Up to this time, each part of a firearm had been hand-tooled, and if the trigger of one broke, the trigger of another might or might not fit. About 1798, Whitney seized upon the idea of having machines make each part so that all the triggers, for example, would be as much alike as the successive imprints of copperplate engraving. Journeying to Washington, he reportedly dismantled 10 of his new muskets in the presence of skeptical officials, scrambled the parts together, and then quickly reassembled 10 different muskets. The principle of interchangeable parts was widely adopted by 1850. It gave rise to a host of other innovations, including Samuel Colt's fabled revolver, and it ultimately became the basis of modern mass production, assembly line methods that set the northern states on the path to thoroughgoing industrialization. Ironically, the same Yankee, Eli Whitney, by perfecting the cotton gin, had also given slavery a renewed lease on life, making the Civil War more likely. Yet, by nourishing the North's Industrial Revolution, Whitney conferred upon the Union a massive advantage when that showdown finally came. The sewing machine, invented by Elias Howe in 1846 and perfected by Isaac Singer, gave another strong boost to northern industrialization. The sewing machine became the foundation of the ready-made clothing industry, which took root about the time of the Civil War. It drove many a seamstress from the shelter of the private home to the factory, where, like a human robot, she tended to the clattering mechanisms. Each momentous new invention seemed to stimulate still more imaginative inventions. For the decade ending in 1800, only 306 patents were registered in Washington, but the decade ending in 1860 saw the amazing total of 28,000. Yet in 1838, the clerk of the patent office resigned in despair, complaining that all worthwhile invention had been discovered. Technical advances spurred equally important changes in the form and legal status of business organizations. The principle of limited liability aided the concentration of capital by permitting the individual investor, in cases of legal claims or bankruptcy, to risk no more than his own share of the corporation's stock. 15 Boston families formed one of the earliest investment capital companies, the Boston Associates. They eventually dominated the textile, railroad, insurance, and banking businesses of Massachusetts. Laws of free corporation, first passed in New York in 1848, meant that businessmen could create corporations without applying for individual charters from the legislature. Samuel F.B. Morse's telegraph was among the inventions that tightened the sinews of increasingly complex business world. A distinguished but poverty-stricken portrait painter, Morse finally secured from Congress, to the accompaniment of the usual jeers, an appropriation of $30,000 to support his experiment with talking wires. In 1844, Morse strung a wire 40 miles from Washington to Baltimore and tapped out the historic message, "What hath God wrought?" The invention brought fame and fortune to Morse, and as he put distantly, separated people in almost instant communication with one another. By the eve of the Civil War, a web of singing wires spanned nearly the entire continent, revolutionizing news gathering, diplomacy, and finance. Thus, by the time of the fabled London World's Fair in 1851, known as the Great Exhibition, American products were prominent among the world's commercial wonders. Fairgoers crowded into the dazzling Crystal Palace to see McCormick's Reaper, Morse's telegraph, Colt's firearms, and Charles Goodyear's vulcanized rubber goods. Okay, that's the first half. Yahoo!